Thanks so much, Peg. It's great to be here. I used to say this was my favorite reading series, and then I started to host one, and so I guess I can't say that anymore because, well, we're all in the same parks. There are a lot of great series in the Bay Area, and this is definitely one of my favorites. I always end up apologizing for the fact that there's nothing about beer in the piece that I read. So, but this notion of the unspeakable is something that really fascinated me and compelled me as I wrote this book. And so the theme tonight, everybody knows, is actually quite perfect. And I want you guys to know that I did not alter the text in any way to fit the theme. Grosse Pointe, 1980. The December light faded so suddenly I could hardly read my own words. Rather than switch on the chandelier, I slid my high school application essay across the dining table, closer to the bay window. Snow was beginning to fall. The empty house creaked around me as I bore down on my paragraphs, determined to get down exactly how things had felt the summer before, when everything changed, it seemed, overnight. I wrote about my parents' faces, pale and swollen with sleeplessness, and the knotted feeling inside my stomach. Something terrible was happening. My mother had given up playing backgammon. My father had stopped leaving for work. I described the hushed voices, the closed doors, my gnawing sense that everything would come apart at any moment, that only a barely discernible tensing of all my muscles might hold it together. My parents sealed themselves in the library for days. "Whatever you do," my father said as he pulled the door behind him, "do not come in here." Whitney and I sat on the porch watching TV, our blank faces masking our alarm, buoyed at least partly by The Brady Bunch, Bewitched, Happy Days. My younger brother's auburn hair was oddly disheveled, his trousers an inch too short. How I envied my older brothers, both of them off at college. Charlie a sophomore and Bobby a senior. On day 3, my parents emerged, drained, older, yet united in their conviction that we should know the truth. "It's so awful to have to tell you this," my mother began in a cracked voice, the puffed wedges underneath her eyes by now a deep purple. "But it's important you know. Your brother Charlie is a drug dealer." Her eyes filled up with tears and she looked away. My father dragged on his cigarette dismissively. "We're taking him out of college, putting him into the Marines to clean him up." As my mother wept, my father put his cigarette into the ashtray and gently rested both his hands on her shoulders. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen him touch. "You must never mention a word about this to anyone outside the family," my mother said to Whitney and me with unusual sternness, wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand. "Nobody at all." I felt the news and accompanying emotions seal themselves off inside my body with the ease of a closing elevator door. Drug dealers were something you saw on TV, not in my own family. I remembered an episode of Starsky and Hutch where the drug dealer lived in an abandoned apartment on the outskirts of town. Starsky kicked in the door while Hutch aimed the gun. I turned on the chandelier so that I could reread my essay. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, and a few stray sparrows pecked aimlessly at the frozen ground. My last winter in Michigan Next year I'd be gone, away at boarding school for 9th grade and away from this house. I've been waiting to go since 6th grade, counting down the years impatiently. The applications all asked for an essay on an experience that had changed my life. And so while other 8th graders wrote about their golden retrievers dying, I wrote about Charlie's drug bust and what it had done to our family, the shame and silence spreading from my parents to us, and then into just about every aspect of our lives. Charlie had been selling cocaine, a drug I knew about from Time magazine. I'd seen pictures of it, lines of white powder on the cover. My parents had heard the news from Charlie's college dean earlier that year in the spring. He was expelled and under pressure from my parents, immediately enrolled in Marine boot camp in San Diego, leaving in early June. But as June passed into July, everything kept changing, and the tension in the house got only worse. So I'm going to skip ahead to boot camp graduation. My parents went out to San Diego. On the day of the ceremony, as I heard later, my parents waited in the auditorium, holding their programs, eager to see Charlie graduate into his new life, desperate to put the whole ordeal behind them. But when the Marines filed in, clean and spiffed up in their blue uniforms and broad-brimmed Marine hats, my parents noticed that Charlie was not among them. Confused, my father walked up the aisle to look into the hallway. There was Charlie, stiff with fear in his uniform, handcuffed and surrounded by several federal agents. My father went back into the auditorium and took my mother out by the arm. Charlie was gone, done for. They drove back to La Jolla, my mother in tears, my father shocked and humiliated, both of them determined to conceal from their host what had happened. Their worst nightmare was unfolding. Charlie's drug bust would surely make it into the papers now, especially if he ended up in prison. Everyone in Grosse Pointe would know. Everyone, everywhere. Thank you.